who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Laura, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the January 4th issue of the New York Times Style section on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. She tried to kill the president. He loved her anyway. A retired widower married Sarah Jane Moore, who shot at President Ford in 1975. It tore his family apart. By Stephen Kurutz. Things started to go wrong for the Chase family not long after Susie Chase Motzkin suggested to her 85-year-old father, Philip Chase, that he sign up for a dating site. At the time, Phil was bereft over the loss of his wife of 60 years, Marion Cruz Chase, who had died the year before. On a typical night, he found himself alone in the couple's lakefront home in Whispering Pines, North Carolina, watching Dancing with the Stars. He longed for companionship. Phil, a retired psychologist who had served in the Navy during World War II, followed his daughter's advice. On eHarmony, he was matched with an 80-year-old woman in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, who gave her name as Sarah Kahn. Sarah was well-read and loved to laugh, qualities Phil found attractive. They even shared the same birthday. They spent hours talking on the phone and then on Skype. Now, more than 15 years after the relationship started, Phil's daughter is filled with anguish. On a recent afternoon at her mountaintop home near Woodstock, New York, Susie, who trains ski instructors for a living, seemed overwhelmed at times as she recalled everything her family had been through. Laid out on a long wooden table were the email printouts, cassette tapes, and transcripts of phone conversations she had saved, a catalog of the Chase family's upheaval. "Be careful what you wish for looms a little bit," Susie said, referring to her suggestion that her father try online dating. His conversations with Sarah started in July 2010. A few weeks later, Phil drove from his home in North Carolina to the Catskills, where the Chase family owned land, to visit his two grown children, Susie and her brother Crew. He didn't say much about his new friend, just that they were hitting it off. On his way back to North Carolina, Phil made a stop in Pennsylvania to meet Sarah face to face. They flirted and laughed over brunch. Then Sarah packed a suitcase and joined him for the rest of the drive south. She spent a week at the house in Whispering Pines. After her visit, Phil tried to put into words what he was going through in an email to Susie and Crew. "I cannot really convey to you the intensity of my feelings for her, as they are, with absolutely no disrespect for your mother, such as I have never felt before." As effusive as he was about his emotional state, he was less forthcoming about the woman he had fallen for. In the email, he offered only a thumbnail biography of Sarah, saying she had once lived in California, where she had been married to an executive at RKO Pictures. He added that her Hollywood experience had left her extremely protective of her privacy. He also mentioned that she was estranged from her children. Days later, Phil emailed again to tell his children that Sarah had gone back to Pennsylvania to close down her rental apartment there. She was moving in with him. Susie was alarmed and determined to learn everything she could about Sarah Kahn. When an online search revealed nothing, she asked her father the name of the RKO film executive she had been married to. John Alberg, he said. Susie Googled that name and the name of her father's girlfriend. When she saw the results of her search, she started shaking. Sarah Kahn was better known as Sarah Jane Moore. On September 22, 1975, she had tried to assassinate President Gerald R. Ford with a .38 caliber revolver. She had been paroled in 2007 after having served more than 30 years of a life sentence in federal prison. Susie called her brother and got his voicemail. She screamed into the phone, "Crew, call me as soon as you get this. Oh my God." The questions Susie and Crew had to ask themselves: how do you accept someone new in the family? How do you determine if your elderly parent is fit to make major life decisions? Are faced by thousands of people every day. The Chases experienced an extreme version. What if your dad found new love with someone who had tried to kill a U.S. president? Sarah Jane Moore died in September at age 95. But for Phil's loved ones, her impact is still being felt. "She just completely exploded our family dynamic," Susie said. Susie and Crew said a hallmark of their home when they were growing up was honesty. So they were especially frustrated when their father seemed unwilling to accept any account of Sarah Jane's life other than the one she presented to him. If he had read Housewife Assassin, The Woman Who Tried to Kill President Ford by Jerry Spieler, a deeply researched biography of Sarah Jane first published in 2008, he would have learned of how troubled she had been long before the assassination attempt. Born Sarah Jane Kahn in 1930, she grew up in a middle-class household in Charleston, West Virginia. She was described by a teacher quoted in Mr. Spieler's book as a little odd. She seemed unable to connect with her peers, yet demanded to be the center of attention. At 16, she disappeared for 3 days, making her parents frantic with worry, and she offered no explanation upon her return. Her first marriage to Marine Corps Staff Sergeant ended up in divorce. She had 3 children with her second husband, an Air Force officer, but gave them up to her parents to raise. A 4th child was born with serious complications and institutionalized. Living in Los Angeles during the 1960s, Sarah Jane worked as an accountant at RKO Studios. There she met the man who would become her 3rd husband, John O. Alberg, the Oscar-winning head of the RKO sound department, who had worked on the classics Citizen Kane and It's a Wonderful Life. After a month of marriage and pregnant with their child, Sarah Jane fled and started over once more, moving to the Bay Area. By 1967, she was married again, this time to a doctor, and living in the East Bay city of Danville, California. While that marriage was disintegrating, Sarah Jane became an activist. In the wake of political assassinations, Vietnam and Watergate, revolutionary groups like the Weathermen and the Symbionese Liberation Army sought to achieve their aims through violent acts. In 1974, the SLA kidnapped Patty Hearst, the 19-year-old daughter of the newspaper baron Randolph A. Hearst, from her college apartment in Berkeley. As news of the kidnapping and Miss Hearst's involvement in a bank robbery made headlines, Sarah Jane volunteered at People in Need, a food bank funded by Mr. Hearst at the SLA's behest. "God has sent me," she reportedly told her colleagues before taking over as the bookkeeper. As she allied herself with other revolutionary groups, she also became an FBI informant. In a few short years, Sarah Jane had gone from an unhappy housewife to the star of her own spy drama. It was a dangerous time to be a government mole. One of the activists she kept tabs on, Wilbert Popeye Jackson, was mysteriously murdered in his car in June 1975. Word got out about Sarah Jane's double life. She received death threats. On September 5, 1975, Lynette Frum, a follower of Charles Manson known as Squeaky, aimed a .45 caliber pistol at President Ford while he was walking through a park in Sacramento. Secret Service agents subdued her before she was able to fire. In the wake of that failed attempt, Sarah Jane, now a single mother living in the Mission District, decided to kill the president herself. On the morning of September 22, 1975, she made 3 phone calls to a Secret Service agent, to her FBI contact, and to a San Francisco Police Department inspector. She was unable to reach any of them. Then she made another call to a local gun dealer. She said she wanted to buy a firearm on behalf of a friend. President Ford was attending a meeting that day at the St. Francis Hotel on Union Square in San Francisco. Sarah Jane waited outside in a crowd. When the president appeared, she raised her revolver and fired. "I was aiming for a headshot," she said in an interview for the 2024 documentary Suburban Fury. She missed her target by inches. As she prepared to fire a second time, a former Marine, Oliver Sipple, grabbed her arm. The image of a 45-year-old former housewife assassin puzzled the news media. Sarah Jane offered muddled explanations about wanting to start a revolution. Though she would plead guilty, she was never fully contrite. "There comes a point when the only way you can make a statement is to pick up a gun," she said shortly after her arrest. In 1979, while serving a life term, she made news again when she and another prisoner scaled a 12-foot-high barbed wire fence at a correctional facility in West Virginia. She was captured 4 hours after her escape. Ms. Spieler, the author, tried to understand Sarah Jane's character while interviewing her and corresponding with her in the years before the publication of her book. "No matter how wonderful you were or what you did, she would turn and accuse you of something," Miss Spieler said. But Sarah Jane was very charming. She would be your neighbor, your aunt, your friend. No one saw her coming. In the late summer of 2010, Susie and crew told their father what they had learned about Sarah Jane and warned him to be careful. Phil knew all about her past, he said, and given his PhD in psychology and the decades he had spent working in that field, he felt able to offer a diagnosis. At the time of the assassination attempt, he wrote in an email to his children, Sarah Jane was mightily confused and emotionally fragile. Furthermore, she had paid her debt to society, and she simply made him happy. "We have more damn fun together," he wrote. The Chase family wondered how their kind, rational, loving patriarch could embrace someone with such a past. Phil had been a corporate psychologist for companies like Pillsbury and a professor at Marist College, a warm-hearted man who liked to share his knowledge at the dinner table. His wife of more than 6 decades, Marion, was Sarah Jane's opposite, an avid golfer and painter who loved to throw parties. But the children knew from comments Phil had made that their parents' marriage had been sexless for years. By contrast, Sarah Jane showered Phil with compliments about his successful career, his broad shoulders, and his sexual prowess. Even before they had met in person, she called him her dazzlin' amazing dude. She was mentally stimulating for him in a way that other women weren't, said Phil's granddaughter, Chelsea Alfano, 36. To me, it felt like he met her, and it was this fascinating pet project. While Phil defended his new relationship, Sarah Jane started making the case for herself in emails and phone calls with his 2 children. Susie recorded some of the calls and is now using the recordings, along with old emails, to write a memoir. In an email sent in late August 2010, a month after meeting Phil, Sarah Jane told Susie and crew that she loved their father with an intensity I have never known before. She added that she would not ever do anything to hurt this delightful man. She also acknowledged that at the start of the relationship, she had not been forthcoming about her past, describing herself as not totally open but honest. She tried to elicit sympathy by describing what life was like for someone in her position. Becoming well-known, infamous, on my own was a shocking experience, she wrote. the incredible, awful curiosity of everyone, and everyone acted like they had a right to know absolutely everything. In the fall of 2010, Phil and Sarah Jane were living as partners, as he informed his daughter in an email. But then Sarah Jane told Phil it was illegal for her to be living with someone out of wedlock in North Carolina. She was violating the terms of her parole, she said, and could be sent back to prison at any time. While it's true that there was one such law, it had been ruled unconstitutional 4 years earlier. In December 2010, 5 months after they had met on eHarmony, Phil and Sarah Jane were married by a magistrate. He notified his children of the union in an email. A woman so notorious that she had been a character in the Stephen Sondheim musical Assassins, alongside John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald, was now the stepmother to Susie and Crew. As Sarah Jane tried to integrate herself into the Chase family, their lives took on a surreal quality. Susie met her new stepmother for the first time in the summer of 2011. When the recently married couple visited the Catskills home, Susie shared with her husband, David Motzkin, an engineer. The 14-acre property had once been part of a 500-acre farm and mountaintop purchased by Phil's grandmother, Lula Chase. Susie, who is now 68 years old, tried to be welcoming, but she was unsettled by something Sarah Jane said when her father was in the bathroom. If she had her way, Sarah Jane told her, Susie and her brother would get nothing from their father's estate. They already had so much. Mr. Motzkin, 70, also heard the remark. Sarah Jane also laid claim to their late mother's possessions, if not her role as matriarch. When Susie and Crew asked if they could have some of Marion's landscape paintings, Sarah Jane said no, adding that she hadn't yet decided which paintings she wanted to hang. Phil, who didn't like conflict, deferred to his new wife on this and other matters. One day, Phil went for a walk in the woods with his son. "I said, 'Dad, she's playing you. Wake up,'" recalled Crew, 71. "He told me, 'Son, I've made my decision. I don't want to talk about it anymore.'" Family get-togethers were often marred by Sarah Jane's chilling comments. Mr. Motzkin recalled a dinner during which Sarah Jane said she had missed President Ford only because of the faulty sighting on the gun she had used. She would have succeeded in killing him, she said, if she had sighted the weapon herself. On another occasion, Susie listened to her stepmother discuss how to make a prison shank. Phil usually sat quietly as Sarah Jane dominated the conversation. Yet, if someone offered a criticism that upset her, he would say, "I will not let you talk about my wife that way." He also asked his family not to reveal Sarah Jane's criminal past to others. The request created a veil of secrecy around the couple that isolated them socially and further worried his children. Something else struck Susie. She thought it was odd that her stepmother seemed so chummy with the Secret Service agent who kept watch over her. In addition to protecting high government officials, the Secret Service keeps tabs on people who have shown an inclination to harm those in their charge. Sarah Jane had introduced the agent to Phil as her nephew. Sarah Jane could be syrupy sweet, but only to select people. And she had a volcanic temper, which surfaced whenever the story she told about herself was questioned or contradicted. Susie showed a reporter a video of one such incident, a recording of a Skype call in 2012. Susie asks her father about a friend of Sarah Jane's who had visited their house in North Carolina and whether the Secret Service agent was concerned about this visitor. Susie is calm, but there's a subtext of fear to her question, given that her father is living with someone able to fire point blank at a president. Sarah Jane, who is listening in, seems incensed at the intrusion. She makes clear that, in her view, the authority of a wife supersedes that of her stepchildren. You have no right to question or be concerned about who we invite into our home, she says. I am your father's wife. I am his wife, and this is my home, as well as his. She steps off screen in a fury. Phil, in his usual role as conciliator, tries to ease the tension. I'm sorry about the blow-up here, he says, explaining in the gentle tone of a therapist that Sarah Jane is hypersensitive about how people perceive her. That brief exchange was a rare one-on-one moment in those years between father and daughter. Family members said that Sarah Jane was always present during calls, listening to what was said and chiming in. She seemed to be controlling access to her husband with his meek acceptance. In 2014, Phil, at the age of 89, had knee replacement surgery. While recovering, he fell and broke a hip. After that, Susie said, his health and cognition began to deteriorate, and he deferred more and more to his wife. Tensions between the couple and Phil's children intensified. The rupture came about when Sarah Jane discovered that Crew had been arrested for felony drug possession in 1983 when he was 29, and had spent a year in jail. She said he could no longer visit the home in North Carolina. Associating with a felon was a violation of her parole. Crew had been open about his dislike of Sarah Jane from the beginning. Early on, during a visit to his father's home, he asked her why she had given up her children. On that same visit, he said he had witnessed Sarah Jane using guilt and tears to manipulate Phil. Now, he believed, she was trying to turn his father against him. Ultimately, Phil sided with his wife. Father and son stopped talking. The silence between them lasted 3 years, and Phil's hands would nervously shake at the mention of his son's name. It was one of the most painful experiences of my life, Crew said. For all her concern about privacy, Sarah Jane made a guest appearance on CNN while she was married to Phil. It took place on September 22, 2015, the 40th anniversary of her attempt on President Ford's life, and 8 years since she had gotten out of federal prison. She seemed vibrant, cheerful, and younger than her 85 years. The anchor, Alison Camerota, asked why she was still on parole, when it seemed she was now an upstanding citizen who had turned over a new leaf. Sarah Jane seemed to find fault with the premise of the question. Well, I was always a pretty good citizen, she said sharply, though with the hint of a smile. Let's not talk about turning over a new leaf. Susie often thought about driving to North Carolina and removing her father from the situation, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. She had no legal recourse, for one thing, and the idea of passing judgment on another person, even someone like her stepmother, went against her character. Susie had always seen herself as a healer, someone who tries to love the unloved. That was before Sarah Jane had come into her life. In 2013, Susie was diagnosed with cancer. I was so stressed out all the time, she said. In 2017, Phil sold the house in Whispering Pines and moved with Sarah Jane to Belle Meade, a retirement community in Southern Pines, North Carolina. There he ran into Gloria Wyatt, a fellow resident who had gone to college with Phil's first wife and had socialized with the couple. Ms. Wyatt, 98, said in an interview that the Phil she encountered at Belle Meade was different from the Live Wire and Dickens she used to know. He and Sarah Jane typically ate alone in the dining room, she added, arriving early and not socializing with other residents. He rarely spoke. In 2018, Sarah Jane spent several weeks in the hospital for back surgery. For the first time in years, Susie was able to see her father one-on-one during a visit to the retirement village. Crew also went to North Carolina and made amends with him. The two hugged, and they said they loved each other. Phil also called his granddaughter. It was the first solo chat they'd had in years. "We had a really good heart-to-heart," Chelsea said. "He got a little emotional on the phone. He told me he loved me a bunch of times." With Sarah Jane laid up in the hospital, Phil admitted he had made a mistake marrying her. According to Susie, they were talking about life lessons coming out of the family strife when he said, "I learned not to get married again." 4 months after the family reunion in August 2018, Phil suffered a stroke. He died in a North Carolina hospital at 93. He was cremated. In the aftermath of his death, Susie and crew discovered that, during his marriage to Sarah Jane, Phil's will had been changed several times. With each amendment, the portion of his estate allotted to his wife increased. One of the executors was the son-in-law of a longtime friend of Sarah Jane's, a man Phil had met only once. Sarah Jane received 1/3 of Phil's assets, including his pension and annuity, which Susie and crew estimated to be worth around $700,000. More distressing to them, she kept the household belongings and family heirlooms. As later confirmed by Sarah Jane in a deposition, Phil had asked her, but had not stipulated in his will, to give certain family items to his children upon his death. But as the months dragged on, Sarah Jane held on to their mother's paintings and other possessions, including the Chase family genealogy, furniture, and a carved lion Susie had made as a child for her mother. Sarah Jane also kept the urn containing Phil's remains. "His ashes," crew said. "She wouldn't give us his ashes." Yet Sarah Jane had left North Carolina and moved on. Just months after Phil's death, she went on an extended trip to Europe and Israel with another man. Things got weirder in February 2019. Sarah Jane Moore, now going by the name Sarah J. Chase, was arrested at John F. Kennedy Airport after returning from abroad. Because she had not notified her parole officer about the trip, she ended up back in jail for 6 months. Even at age 89, Sarah Jane was creating a life of high drama and entanglements. The next year, Susie and crew filed a suit challenging the will. During a deposition, Sarah Jane acknowledged having told Phil that he should disinherit his children. The case ended in a settlement. Sarah Jane would return the family heirlooms to Susie and crew, as well as their father's ashes. Susie said that she and her brother got back some of what they wanted, but not all of it. In 2023, Susie received a phone call from a man in Nashville. He said his father-in-law, known as Papa, had joined an online dating service, Silver Singles, and was matched with a Sally Chase from Pennsylvania. Papa spoke with Sally every day on the phone. She laughed at his jokes. He was smitten. Papa's family members grew suspicious. Who was this woman? They went online to do a little research. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times Style section on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. 1 week without smartphones on a college campus. A student organized Tech Fast at St. John's College thrust young people headfirst into a world of chalkboard-based communications. On that note, has anyone seen Eliza? By Callie Holterman. The flyers began appearing around campus in early December. "The world without a phone," they read, in heavy text that had been plunked out on a typewriter. The posters were pasted in dorms at St. John's College in Santa Fe, New Mexico, a small and rigorous liberal arts school in the foothills of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Each one outlined an agenda for 6 days of abstinence from smartphones and other devices connected to the internet. A period of fasting, the flyers promised, a self-study, a challenge. Students who were game were instructed to report to Murchison, a dorm on the edge of campus, at 6 p.m. that Sunday. Mary Claire Fagan was waiting for them, stirring a vat of simmering pork pozole in the dorm kitchen. Ms. Fagan, 26, is a junior, and she said that her and other students talked all the time about craving a break from their phones, which pulsed all day long with distractions. They debated giving them up, but doing so seemed inconvenient and isolating. Maybe the solution was to try it together. She made the flyer using a teal Smith Corona typewriter that sat on a windowsill in the dorm's common area and hung copies around campus. She had just sent her family group chat a heads up that she would not be responding to their texts for the next several days. My dad said, "And that's different from when?" she said. In an effort to safeguard young people from the ills of digital life, policymakers around the world have been instituting forced distance between teenagers and their tech. Australia banned social media for those under 16 in December, and New York joined more than a dozen other states in banishing cell phones from the classroom this fall. Some young people, though, are not waiting for government intervention to reevaluate their closeness with technology. On the dorm staircase that evening, 20 St. John's College students who had decided to take part in Miss Fagan's experiment nibbled on zucchini bread and dashed off last messages to their friends. The undertaking was being called a tech fast, and there had already been some debate over which technology was actually the problem. Most people in attendance said they were interested in cutting back on smartphone use and social media, not, say, shutting off the overhead lights. We should maybe call it an electronics fast or something, but that sounds less cool, said Jackson Calhoun, 21, a sophomore. Miss Fagan thought that the exercise should be choose your own adventure. She passed out commitment cards that allowed participants to select which items they wanted to leave behind and why. They could also check off exceptions, like computer use in the library and calling my mother. Then she put a question to the group. Why are you here? This last week, I've spent 7 hours playing Brick Breaker Cash, said Orlena Downs Mayo, 19, a sophomore, referring to a mobile gambling game. And I've won no cash. She continued, I think that I'm going to have so much more time without a phone. One by one, students spoke about feeling alienated from each other by their devices. They described turning to Instagram to numb themselves in moments of stress and sadness, or trying to lessen their reliance on their smartphones, only to be tugged back in. Matteo Ponzi, 19, a sophomore, said he hoped the students might fill the void left by their smartphones with in-person activities, like listening to music as a group. Students followed him into his dorm room and dropped their devices into his hard-sided suitcase. He clasped it shut, climbed on his desk chair, and slid it onto the tippy-top shelf of his closet. Let's just see what happens, he said. The first challenge was waking up on time for class on Monday morning. Most of the students participating in the fast were used to being roused by their iPhone alarms. The ones who didn't have alarm clocks set up a system of wake-up calls carried out by students including A.B. Garrett, a sophomore who knocked on classmates' doors at 9:30 a.m. on Monday. I heard, ugh, and then shuffling, and then, thank you, Ms. Garrett, 19, said afterwards. It was a little weird, but it was fun. She poured a glass of orange juice and drank it outside instead of doing her typical morning scroll. Naomi Weiss relied on her internal clock to wake up in time for her Greek class. A little risky, she said. Ms. Weiss, 20, a sophomore, said she had long felt stuck in a game of digital whack-a-mole. She would delete Instagram only to find herself mindlessly scrolling through Google Maps. Her goal for the week was not to win exactly. Instead, we should be trying to figure out why we're stuck playing this game, she said. The St. John's College, which has another campus in Annapolis, Maryland, is in some ways an ideal setting for such an exercise. The school's Great Books curriculum is focused on reading original works of thinkers like Archimedes, Descartes, and Einstein. Classes are discussion-based, no laptops allowed, and each dorm room on campus is equipped with an oatmeal-colored landline. Several students participating in the fast said they could feel their focus sharpening. Still, the end of the semester loomed, and Samuel Gonzalez was considering just how tech-free he could go without taking a hit to the quality of his final papers. Unfortunately, there's a practical reality that I have to produce 30 pages of writing in the next 2 weeks, said Mr. Gonzalez, 29, a senior, who was carrying his copy of Einstein's Relativity to class. He briefly pictured himself writing them on a typewriter, then decided to use his laptop, so long as it was in the school library. Others were realizing just how much they relied on their phones to track one another down. Ms. Weiss had lent Mr. Ponzi a pillow, but could not find him to get it back. Ms. Garrett was out of breath from racing around campus, trying to find a friend who had borrowed her car keys. In the dining hall, students had set up a blackboard where they could exchange notes. "Looking for Eliza," Ms. Garrett had written by Monday afternoon. "Did you find Eliza?" someone else followed up. "Eliza must be found." For these members of Gen Z, navigating life with landlines and sticks of chalk was something of a novelty. For much of the school's faculty, it had simply been the college experience. Sarah Davis, the dean of the Santa Fe campus of St. John's College, remembered students gathering to watch ER in her freshman dorm at Harvard. She had enthusiastically supported the phone-free experiment. She thought it was a good sign that young adults' instincts were telling them to examine the hold that technology had on them. It's not just depriving ourselves, it's actually investigating parts of ourselves that may not be fully expressed when we have so much of our time directed in this one way, she said. The week-long fast was not Miss Fagan's first such experiment. In 2023, she had set out to establish a tech-free dorm in Murchison, where she is a resident assistant. More than a dozen students who moved in began what she described as a beautiful negotiation over the rules. For example, were boom boxes okay? Or did students who wanted to listen to music need to pull out their acoustic guitars? From the beginning, it was hard to find consensus, and Ms. Fagan said she was not interested in becoming the phone police. Over that first year, Murchison's focus shifted from being anti-tech to pro-community, with organized group dinners and theater performances. The idea of a screen-free dorm also bumped up against some realities of modern campus life, in which course schedules, financial aid information, and work-study opportunities are often communicated online, said Carol Carpenter, the Vice President for Communications and Marketing at St. John's College. The administration was figuring out how to balance its support for students' exploration with its responsibilities as an institution, Ms. Carpenter said. What happens if we need to text all the students and the faculty, say something horrible is happening, and say, "You need to shelter in place," or "You need to get to this building," she said. The emergency protocols at St. John's included physical alarms and human emergency coordinators assigned to each building that could reach students who were not accessible by text, she added. The day after the students' week-long fast concluded, 2 students at Brown University were killed by a gunman while studying for an economics class. St. John's is always reviewing its security protocols, Ms. Carpenter wrote in an email afterward. And the Brown event is on our minds. If students organize future tech fasts, we will heartily support them so long as they're voluntary. It had become clear to college leadership that St. John's could be an ally to students who wanted to keep tech from seeping further into their lives. There's a hunger for this, she said. By midweek, students said they felt more immersed in the world around them. They met up to handwrite letters to family members and discuss self-reliance, the poem by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Oh, what is heaven but the fellowship of minds that each can stand against the world by its own meek and incorruptible will. They could not text one another to say they were running late. They had to make plans in person and actually show up for them. Sometimes they found themselves reaching for their pockets reflexively, as if a phantom iPhone might still be there. Everyone had hit some snag or another. Annie Frost, 23, said she was happy about how little she craved her devices. But she was running low on clean laundry, and most of the machines on campus were operated via smartphone. We've set ourselves up to not be able to put screens aside, added Miss Frost, a sophomore. The students were also reckoning with the fact that smartphones were more necessary for some than others. Eliza Kaufman, 20, a sophomore who has jobs on the campus mailroom and as a RA, had kept her phone accessible in case one of her residents had an emergency. When it came time to deposit her paychecks, she realized she could not do it efficiently without her mobile banking app. As college students, we're privileged. We are in an intellectual space where this kind of thought experiment and life experiment is one that's supported, she said. But there is still a divide between, I've got to work, and so I've got to use technology to some degree. Over and over, they were asked to defend the decision to give up their devices. Friends wanted to know why they were ignoring texts. Ms. Kaufman asked her music tutor, the school's term for a professor, to borrow a metronome so that she could practice Bach's Prelude in C major at tempo. He was like, "Why do you need a physical metronome? Just get an app," she said. The teacher, Andy Kingston, said he had since come around to the idea of the experiment, so long as the students recognized that theirs was not the first generation to reckon with a wave of technological advancement. Why was Plato so upset about the invention of writing, he said. He urged them to consider, is this a qualitatively different technological moment that they're living through from all the ones they've read? By the end of the week, there had been some cracks in the students' resolve. Chaz Nomura, 20, had fallen back on his phone twice, to text his mother an invitation to the sophomore play that weekend and to print sheet music for his Christian fellowship group. He felt guilty, as if he were doing something illicit. I was like, "Oh, is anyone going to see me?" he said. But even with minor compromises, most students said they had gotten to know themselves better without their phones butting in all day long. Some had fresh appreciation for boredom and inconvenience. The week was more intense than I expected it to feel, Ms. Weiss said. When I'm in a situation where I have nothing to do, I cannot find someone to hang out with other than the people who are around me. In not being able to communicate over distance, I have to be more invested in communicating where I am. The Tech Fast ended with a makeshift awards ceremony around a campus fire pit on Friday night. Rubber band balls were awarded to students who strayed from their own rules but managed to bounce back. One student wrote a poem in honor of Ms. Kaufman, who finally tracked down a metronome. Then came the tough question. Now what? When Miss Fagan looked at her phone again, she had 307 text messages. She said she had not emerged from the week confident that she could give up her smartphone forever. There's sacrifices made to try and live without the technology, she said, and most people around the fire were like, I don't want to make all those sacrifices. She planned to keep the phone out of her dorm room. Other students felt ready to make more drastic changes. Ms. Weiss hoped to push for Murchison dorm to shut off its Wi-Fi permanently. A couple of residents had already lodged their objections. Mr. Ponzi bought a flip phone. He had wanted to check his smartphone on Thursday, but once he picked it back up, he saw that most of the notifications that had piled up were basically meaningless. I was like, "Ooh, I hate this," he said. He said he hoped the fast would encourage others to experiment with altering their digital lives, even if that did not mean overhauling them. On Sunday night, 2 days after the fast had technically ended, there were still a few smartphones lingering in the suitcase where Mr. Ponzi had stashed them. Their owners had not yet bothered to pick them up. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times Style section on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Modern Love. My mother's last best gift was an astonishing secret. It took my mother getting Alzheimer's for my siblings and me to learn the truth about our family and childhood. By Brett Paisel. For years, the story that I built around my childhood and my parents' lives was like a fairy tale, almost cinematic in scope. I grew up in Europe in the 60s and 70s. My parents, American teachers overseas, were beautiful, hilarious, smart, and affectionate with their children and each other. My mother was a painter, my father a teacher. One of my earliest memories of my parents waking me from under a pile of coats at a party and asking me, at age 4, the question they had been arguing about until the early morning hours. You just know wine was involved. Is man basically good or evil? My answer? Which man? Family stories like this were burnished over the years by my brothers and me. There were darker stories, too, which gave our history more texture. My father sometimes took trips by himself, went through weeks-long periods of near silence, and drank heavily. Today, we would recognize these as signs of depression. Back then, he was the standard-issue husband-dad. By comparison, his own father, Julius, had been an abusive drunk who beat him and called my father a sissy until he fled to college and finally found my mother. What I mean to say is that my brothers and I felt like we knew our family story. Certainly, more than a lot of kids did. In high school, one of my friends found out that his father had a whole other family. By comparison, our lack of secrets was almost parochial. Decades later, when I was well into my 50s, my mother was teetering on the cliff of total dementia. The stories she and I told each other had calcified with frequent telling. The details, the same, even the phrasing. But one evening, she shocked me with something new. A secret excavated from the rubble of her battered mind. A secret so complex, painful, and gorgeous that I still think of it as her last best gift. One way that my extremely bright mother would mask her dementia was by starting a conversation with the suggestion that we had already been discussing the topic. This way, if she was repeating herself, it would sound like she already knew that she was repeating herself. That's why, on this particular evening, my mother said, "And you already know, of course, that your father's gay." What? I most certainly did not know that. It never even occurred to me. What the hell was she talking about, gay? She and my father held hands when they watched the news every night. I voiced none of this, because I've spent years mastering the art of losing my mind while presenting as unflappable. "No, Mom," I said, "I didn't know that." "Oh," she said, "your father told me he was gay before we got married." "What?" At this point, my husband walked into the living room, and I shot him a look that said, I will cut you if you come one step closer." He pivoted and walked out. I returned to my mother, who proceeded to tell me the bones of a story without any meat. Already, Alzheimer's was rendering her incapable of nuance or style. My mother had been a great storyteller, often augmenting her tales with drawings on napkins, witty observations, and digressions that were just as interesting as the core story. Not so now. This was what she told me. Back in their 20s, my mother gave my father the marry me or lose me ultimatum That was a standard of the day. But he told her he couldn't because he was gay. She surprised him by saying she wanted to marry him anyway. Her reason? Sketchy because of the lack of nuance, but my guess is that she was already totally in love with him because she was all her life. I'm guessing that another contributing factor was that my mother came from a repressed religious background, Dutch Reformed. Given that, she might have thought that the sex part of marriage wasn't very important. She used to opine that my father liked to actually talk to her rather than pouncing. Well, now we know why. So they got married. My father wanted a family, and he liked my mother more than anyone he'd ever known. He didn't really know what love was, he told her, and I'm guessing that's about right, given what I had heard about his father Julius. There was another part of the deal. He asked for Friday nights to himself. She assumed he went to gay bars, and once, she said, she ran into a strange man in our living room on a Saturday morning. There was another time, she told me, that we were all staying in a hotel and a young man knocked on our door, crying and demanding to talk to my father. And that was pretty much it. Except that she asked me not to say anything about it until he was dead. And I'm sorry/not sorry that I didn't exactly comply with her request. Although I never said anything public or to anyone that he would care about until now, several years after both of their deaths. And I never said anything to him. "Were you happy?" I asked my mother that night, looking into her watery eyes. "Oh, yes," she said. "Oh, yes." And I knew she was telling the truth, because again, no nuance. Not that I would have doubted it. It all made so much sense given my father's long trips alone and Friday nights out. Despite his love of football and rather masculine propensity for long silences, there was his flamboyant style and expression. He gesticulated wildly. And dress, huge dangling medallions, along with his love of opera and well-known gay hangouts. We thought he just liked the decor. It appeared that our family story was not, in fact, cinematic in the fairy tale way I thought. It was less box office holiday movie and more quirky, underfunded indie. It was, I have come to believe, a much deeper story about shame and sacrifice and loyalty and profound love. Recently, my brothers and I have tried to reassemble the story of our family through this new lens. My version is that a young, queer boy beaten by his father, shamed by the family's religion, and ignored by his mother, learns to survive by stuffing down the parts of himself that leave him vulnerable to ridicule and violence. And he's lucky. He's good-looking, intellectually gifted, and thank God, very funny. And then he meets this knockout of a woman who's just as smart as him, or smarter, he used to say, funny too, and she loves him. Even when he tells her what he thinks is the worst of it, she doesn't shrink. She says, "Okay, I can do that. I'll stand by you and give you children, and we'll have adventures, and you will be my biggest fan. Because of you, life will never be boring." She said this about my father often. "I will travel the world, and my paintings will be exhibited in famous churches and colleges. And when we get old, we will watch the news every night and hold hands. We will sleep in the same bed, safe in our understanding of how much we love each other." Years later, when he was close to death and my mother was all but lost to Alzheimer's, I asked my father whether he wanted to try to prolong his life or let go. He said quite clearly, "I have had a long and interesting life. I got more than I deserved out of the deal." And he let go. Family secrets are nothing new. In fact, before 23andMe and the internet, there were a lot more of them. But when I look at curated stories on social media, posed family photos, and engagement announcements, "Look at my ring," I can't help but think that these images often miss the better story. Come on, it's always better when there's a big bad secret to overcome. Keep your wimpy stories about falling in love at first sight and how perfect it all went. First of all, probably not true. But second, where's the triumph the vindication, the B-plot, and the poetic justice. After all, despite Julius's efforts to beat the sissy out of him, my father did indeed have a long and interesting life. He lived it with his best friend. These days, when I see them in my mind, they are almost always together, leaning into each other conspiratorially, as if guarding the precious and overlooked truth that love rarely looks like the stories we've been sold. It's quiet, personal, hard, and deep. Those lucky enough to know this love are mostly keeping it to themselves. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the January 4th issue of the New York Times Style section. Your reader has been Laura. Thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have the USA Today. Following that at 2 o'clock is episode number 5 of Mark Twain by Ron Chernow. Stay with us. You're listening to the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, broadcasting daily readings 24 hours a day of newspapers, magazines, and books to area people who are blind or have a print disability, who are provided reading radios. Radio Reading's broadcast signal is provided at no charge by WNED. Radio Reading Studios are at 1199 Harlem Road in Cheektowaga, between William and Clinton Streets. Radio Reading's website is nfradioreading.org. For more information on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, call us at 716-821-5555.